illustrate those differences. The Richard Viguerie, the so-called direct mail king of new right candidates and causes and publisher of Conservative Digest, Norman Podhoretz, editor of Commentary Magazine, and a leading figure in the so-called neoconservative movement, ex-liberal Democrats who favor strong foreign and defense policies to counter the Soviets, and Robert Bartley, editor of the Wall Street Journal, considered by most to be the editorial page godfather of Mr. Reagan's supply-side economic theories. All
my complaint has to do with ideas rather than with people. I actually think many of the appointments are very good, and yet the paradox is that beneath the rhetoric of the Reagan administration, rhetoric some people would characterize as bellicose, I think the policies are basically still those of détente, with the same
foreign policy here.
with the same strategic objective that guided the policy of détente back in 1972, namely to seek a system of incentives and penalties that would induce the Soviet Union to behave moderately or responsibly. Ronald Reagan used to think that approach was an illusion, mainly because he believed that the Soviet Union was not interested in behaving moderately and responsibly, that it had larger ambitions. Yet his administration's tactics seem to now be forming a pattern that aims toward exactly that strategy rather than toward a strategy that would look toward the destabilization of the Soviet Empire by encouraging the forces of disintegration from within that we see operating now in Poland.
And Mr. Bartley, what is your major complaint, sir?
Well, I share both of those concerns, but I guess my major concern is in the area of economics. I'm afraid that Ronald Reagan is going to be shoved off of his tax program, and I suppose we can discuss it more later, but briefly, I think that the idea of raising taxes in a recession is bizarre, both economically and politically.
At the people who are making the decisions in this White House, for the most part, they are people who were opposing Ronald Reagan 2 years ago at this time. Philosophically, they had ideological disagreements, strong ones, with President Reagan. And if you want to look for people who were in the snows of New Hampshire supporting Ronald Reagan ideologically 2 years ago, you'd be hard-pressed to find them. The few that have been in there in 1981, or were there in 1981, or seem like many of them are moving out. Dick Allen, Len Knopfsinger, Mr. Roberts, Bill Gribben, while the Bush people seem to be moving up in the administration, and many of the Reagan people are moving out. The situation had been reversed, and Mr. Bush had won the Republican nomination and had been elected president. Would it be the key people in the Reagan campaign that would be running a Bush presidency?
Well, partly I agree. The essential problem is more one of a management structure than it is of people, that somehow the White House is not set up to really formulate and carry out a coherent policy. So that what you tend to have are pressures kind of welling up from the bottom, from the State Department for détente, or from Congress for tax increases, until finally all of these get up to the president. He has to say yes, no, or this, but the pressures aren't coming down to take the president's agenda down into the government. I think that's a very serious problem, and only partly one of people.
Well, certainly not left of center, no, but a centrist complexion, yes, with qualifications. I think that what you're seeing is the triumph of the forces of inertia, the institutional momentum that's been built into American foreign policy for at least 10 years now, and that includes both a Republican and a Democratic administration. This is a bipartisan set of interests that we're seeing coming to the surface. I think the reason that the old ideas have been prevailing is that the Reagan administration, beginning from the top, one has to say, has not been as serious about changing the direction of the country in foreign policy as it has been in changing the direction of the country in economic and domestic policy. The consequence is very hard to change the direction of a country. You have to work at it. You have to be willing to submit, to take the heat. You have to be willing to fight off the pressures. You have to know where you're going.
To pick up
Many people in this administration who do sympathize with the new direction that I'm advocating, and to me the interesting problem is why they themselves have been unable to exert a greater influence. One could write a kind of reverse the best and the brightest about the foreign policy of the Reagan administration.
Here and turning this a little bit here, I mean, he's got people down there who just are bombarding him with Henry Kissinger's policies.
Henry Kissinger has been criticizing the president from the right in the last week or so.
He does seem to me that the one thing that we do have going for us is that this is a president with his own agenda and is not easily moved by all of these pressures.
You agree with that? Issue. Now, we've read and heard a lot this week about the so-called sin taxes and excise taxes on beer and cigarettes and liquor. He must have 20 advisors telling him to tax these things, and he's saying, no, you know, he's the only one holding out. So he's held firm. He made a serious mistake at the beginning, which I and most every conservative had talked to him, counseled him, said he was making, and that was in his appointments. He appointed people who did not share his vision of this revolution that he talked about bringing to this country.
In old Russia, they used to say about instances of oppression, if only the Tsar knew. Of course, the Tsar did know, and I'm beginning to wonder whether all this exaltation of the president is not of that character. I suspect that we have to judge this president and any other president by the record he compiles. And the record he has compiled, at least in foreign policy, in the first year, is one that I believe does not differ really significantly from the pattern of the last two administrations.
Well, let's hear, Norman. The foreign policy has been a disaster. Jimmy Carter.
Disaster in what?
Well, is in that President Reagan promised the American people he was going to take the foreign policy of this country in a new direction, and he has not done that. This administration has followed the failed policies, basically, of the previous administrations. He's kept many of the personnel have been the same. Jimmy Carter had a firmer, tougher policy on Afghanistan than President Reagan has had on Poland. This is a disgrace. His own ambassador to the United Nations is alleged to be very, very unhappy with the weak response of this administration.
She will not resign. She has denied that she had any intention of resigning, but I suspect that there's some truth in these stories about her feeling that the response of this administration to Poland has been less vigorous and less steady and less strategically healthy than she would have liked to see.
There's one big difference between the Reagan administration and its predecessors, which is that the Reagan administration is spending a lot of money on arms. I think that's a very important and very powerful difference.
I agree with that.
I think that we get kind of a feeling of we're still drifting along with the same kind of irresolution that we have been for the last how many years? Whether
an example. Give me an example of irresolution.
Well, I think the biggest example is the one that grates on me the most is not Poland, but it's the administration's treatment of this yellow rain issue in Southeast Asia. This is the use of weapons, bacteriological weapons, toxin weapons against the Hmong hill tribesmen in Asia. And this is, first of all, it's very likely a deliberate campaign of genocide against these backward people by the Vietnamese. And secondly, it's a contemptuous violation of the 1962 Bacteriological Weapons Convention.
And what would the Reagan...
First of all, I'd have it mentioned by Ronald Reagan, which it hasn't been so far. And I would have them take it to the UN Security Council, which is what the 1972 convention says they're supposed to do with it when they say there are violations, and the administration says there are violations, but it makes a speech somewhere, it has a little testimony, but it doesn't follow the procedures outlined in the treaty. I would certainly have it taken up with in Hague's talks with Gromyko next week, but I haven't heard any indication that'll happen.
I think it was Bill Southwire who laid the whole thing on foreign policy to to the appointment of Alexander Haig as Secretary of State. Do you think that's really what the problem is?
Sure, you can't. I mean, perhaps the issue of human events, the most perhaps widely read Washington conservative publication, is that they called today for Haig's resignation. Said headlines: Haig must go. I think you're going to see a lot of conservatives concerned about Haig. He's talked very hard, very good at what John Mitchell used to talk about. Remember John Mitchell said...
I remember John Mitchell.
John Mitchell said a lot of things. One of the things that he said to some liberals leaders once is, hey, listen, don't pay attention to what we say. Watch what we do, okay? And politicians seem to be very good at that. And Mr. Haig is very good at it. He talks very tough about Cuba, about the Soviets. But what's he doing to stop the Cuban adventurism in South America, in Africa? What's he doing? Nothing.
Let's put I think if there's a problem, it has to be Ronald Reagan. What you need if you're going to turn the country around in this area is executive energy from the top. You need determination, you need a strategic objective, you need a focus. You need to be willing to pay a certain price. George Will said the other day that this is an administration that seems to love commerce more than it loathes communism. That's an endemic weakness in Republican administrations.
But
at this moment, anyway, is a lack of seriousness about the international situation. That is seriousness. I would say that he and they have been very serious about the domestic situation, about the domestic economy. They have not shown a comparable seriousness about the international situation, and yet, if my own reading of the international situation is correct, we are in deeper trouble and greater danger than perhaps ever before in our history. Reagan was elected with a mandate to do something about that. I think he's allowing that mandate to dissipate as with every passing day the precious political resource he came into office with is being diminished.
All right, thank you.
The inflation rate has come down. This is quite an achievement for the administration and for the Federal Reserve. I mean, it's less than 9% over the last year and about 5% in the last quarter. Now we're having a recession, and you can argue about why we're having the recession. My view is that we were supposed to have a two-part policy. One, tight money to cure inflation, and tax cuts to stimulate the economy. And the problem is that for all the rhetoric, we didn't get the tax cuts, or at least didn't get them until very recently, that during 1981, taxes went up. They didn't go down. And we got a recession, a big surprise in my view. And now we're in a recession, and here are all sorts of people saying, well, we got to get rid of all those tax cuts that we've had. It just doesn't make any sense at all to me.
And
because the pressures seem to be, I mean, who's going to write a budget if all of his advisors are on the other side? You know, are he and Nancy going to sit down in the White House and scribble out the budget of the United States?
Well, you have these advisors going on television and apologizing and seeming to come across so weak. Our program just got started 6 months ago, they say. We need another 6 months. We need another year. And that's how losers talk. They're not attacking, and they're not taking the offense. They're being very defensive, and they're going to take everybody down the tubes with them, I'm afraid.
Is that the best thing there is to be said about Ronald Reagan is that he has so far resisted the pressure for cuts in the defense budget, and that he has so far resisted the pressures to abandon his own view of how the economy can be moved. I think whatever else he does, we can credit him with one achievement, which is to have changed the direction of the country in this area. He's put a cap, as has been said, on the growth of federal spending. This is now accepted as a legitimate objective of social policy in the United States. That's a major achievement, and I wish I could say the same for his foreign policy.
To make his policies work, he needs a little more cutting edge than he's displaying right now, and maybe some personnel management changes. Otherwise, he's going to kind of evaporate and grind down into something very, very conventional and probably politically defeatable.
Well, in a sense, I do. I tend to think that Reagan was elected by a potential new majority, but it's not a conservative or Republican majority. I think it's misleading to characterize it in those terms. I think that what happened in 1980 was the welling up of a great demand in this country to recapture the national greatness, to get back to the secrets of American productivity, to restore American power in the world, to make certain that we don't get humiliated again as we did in Iran, to make certain that we have the means to stand up to Soviet imperialism and expansionism and aggressiveness. That was the demand. Reagan was elected because of all the candidates running, he seemed the most likely to be able to satisfy that demand. I think the demand is still there. I think if he fails to satisfy it, we'll be in such deep trouble that I'm not sure we'll have the luxury of an alternative.